In this video, we will go through food chains. So with food chains and food webs, this is energy provided by photosynthesis and producers. So this is where energy will enter into our food chain. And then energy is lost up the food chain. So as energy moves up, there's less and less that gets transferred. Organisms need energy to function and survive. The rest is going to be stored. So with a food chain, it's going to show the feeding relationship among organisms. And what the arrows show is the flow of energy in a food chain. So this is not necessarily showing what is eating what, but it is showing how energy is moving within an ecosystem and moving amongst different organisms. So here, we have algae that is providing energy to this mosquito larvae. So energy is being transferred from algae to larvae, and the algae are getting energy from the sun, and that energy in the algae, like I said, is transferred to the larvae. The energy within the larvae gets transferred to these flies here, and then the energy within the flies get transferred to the perch. The energy within the perch gets transferred to the pike. So the arrow, the direction that the arrow is pointing is very important. The arrow means energy movement. It does not mean that this pike is eating the perch. So within our food chain, we have different categories of how things get their energy. So there are producers. These are organisms that carry out photosynthesis and they produce their own energy. Consumers are organisms that eat other organisms to attain energy because they cannot produce their own food. And then within the consumers, there are several subtypes. There is the primary consumer, which eats producers, and they are also called herbivores. There are secondary consumers, which feed on primary consumers. These are carnivores. And tertiary consumers, which feed on secondary consumers, also carnivores. And so those carnivores, those are organisms that eat meat. Scavengers are carnivores that eat the remains of dead animals, and omnivores are consumers that eat both animals and plants. Now, when things die and then they decay, they're decayed by decomposers or these detritivores. So these are consumers that feed on the remains of dead organisms and animal waste. For example, earthworms and maggots and bacteria are examples of decomposers. Arrows in food chains, as I mentioned, show flow of energy, but they also show the flow of energy from trophic level to another trophic level. And so a trophic level refers to how an organism gains their energy on a food chain. So a trophic level also refers to the position of an organism within a food chain. So for example, the plant would be the first trophic level, the herbivore here would be the second trophic level, the mouse here would be the third trophic level, the snake would be the fourth, and then this hawk here would be the fifth trophic level. So here we'll label our trophic levels, and we'll label our organisms as well. So our grass here would be our producer, and then this would be our first trophic level. The cricket would be our primary consumer, and this would be our second trophic level. The bird would be our secondary consumer, and our third trophic level. And then the snake would be our tertiary consumer and would make up our fourth trophic level. So you may be wondering, or you may have noticed, or may not have occurred to you yet, but you can ask the question, why is a food chain limited to no more than 5 trophic levels? So typically, the fifth trophic level is as high as most food chains will get. You don't get into 6 trophic levels. You might have the odd example, but most food chains are limited to no more than 5 trophic levels. So why is that? This is due to what's referred to as the pyramid of energy. This pyramid is based on the available food energy at each trophic level. So the most energy here is available at the producer level. So here is our pyramid, and then each division represents a trophic level. So at the bottom of the pyramid, we would have our first trophic level. So here is the first trophic level, the second, third, and then fourth trophic level. So you'll notice that at each energy level, there is less energy available at each corresponding level, or the level above it. So within each trophic level, a lot of that energy gets used or is lost. The majority is actually lost through heat and cellular metabolism. And so a small majority only actually gets passed on. Only 10% of the energy within a trophic level gets passed on, and then 10% within that gets passed on, and then 10% within that gets passed on. So by the time you reach that fifth trophic level, there is very little energy available at that fifth trophic level to sustain those organisms. So why is that? Well, most organisms will use most of their energy for life functions. So only about 10% of the available energy at a given trophic level is transferred to the next level. So this diagram just shows the fact that the energy available will affect the abundance of organisms that you find within each trophic level. So within the first trophic level, where the most energy is available, these organisms will be the most abundant. So if you think about grass, you got a lot of grass compared to everything else. And these primary consumers here, because there's a lot of grass to support, these rabbits, they tend to be in a higher number. Although there's a lot less rabbits than there are grass. And then the energy that can be transferred from that second trophic level to the third trophic level, means that, there's few predators for these rabbits. And then ultimately, the organisms at the top of that food chain, there aren't that many of them, so there's very little energy available to them. So, for example, we'll use 1,000 joules as our example of energy that would be available in the first trophic level. If only 10% of that is transferred over, that means there is 100 joules of energy in that second trophic level. 900 joules is lost due to life functions. And then if 10% of that 100 joules is transferred to the next energy level, that's only 10 joules of energy available to these organisms. And then by the time you get to that fourth trophic level, you have 1 joule of energy available. And so this is a small amount of energy available for these organisms at the top of the food chain. So any higher, as you get into that fifth, energy is scant, but beyond fifth, there's typically not enough energy to support organisms at that sixth and seventh trophic level. So with food webs now, these are more complicated but more realistic to life than food chains. So food chains only show energy flow in one direction here. Um, with a food web, you can get multiple food chains in there. So this shows the variety of ways. A food web will show the variety of ways in which an organism can obtain energy. So, for example, if we look at the deer, energy is transferred to the deer from the grass and from the tree. So, it means the deer is can consume, trees and grass and get energy from them. If you look at the owl, an owl can get energy from the bird, from the squirrel, from the rabbits as well. So many different sources of energy, and from the mouse as well. So many different sources of energy for that owl. So within a food web, you should be able to identify an individual food chain. So you always start with the producer, and then just kind of follow the arrows. So here we have one, and then that rabbit gets consumed by the owl. So this would be one food chain. Another food chain, we would have the grass, we would have the rabbit, and then we would have the fox. Another possible food chain that we could have, again, is grass, which is consumed by the grasshopper here, which is consumed by the mouse, which can be consumed by the hawk. And this would be another food chain. So within this food web, there are many different food chains. See how many food chains you can identify. And then, as a little bit of practice as well, use the following food web and determine how many food chains exist within this particular food web. So I'll highlight one food chain for you. So we'll start with the berries. The berries can be consumed by this squirrely rabbit thing here, which can be consumed by the fox, or which transfers its energy to the fox. So that's one food chain. Another possible food chain, you start with these leaves here, which can transfer its energy to the grasshopper, which transfers its energy to the frog, which transfers its energy to the owl. And so that is a second food chain. So I've identified 2 food chains. You identify the rest. So now with pesticides, pesticides are chemicals that destroy anything that humans consider pests. These pests can interfere with our food sources, and so pesticides can take the form of herbicides, which will kill weeds, which are undesirable plants, insecticides, which kill insects, and fungicides, which kill fungus. So all of these can be considered pests to humans. So pesticides are useful to people because they can prevent damage to crops and resources. So for example, food supplies and forests. They can stop the spread of disease, for example, with mosquitoes and rodents, which can spread different types of disease. So mosquitoes can spread West Nile virus, for example, or dengue virus. Using pesticides to control mosquito populations can help control the spread of disease. And they can prevent the disintegration of products. So, for example, shampoos and carpet. Unfortunately, pesticides are often not specific to the organisms they are designed to kill, Modern pesticides are extremely harmful to all organisms. And the reason why they can be harmful is this process of bioaccumulation. Some pesticides are soluble in fat and not soluble in water, the pesticide DDT, for example. And so, as a result, these toxins cannot be released from the body in sweat or urine, and so the toxin builds up in the fatty tissue. So the body can't get rid of these toxins, it just builds up in the fatty tissue as they're exposed to it. And this can be passed on to other organisms that obtain their energy from that organism. So they not only get energy, but they also get toxins as well. So this process of bioamplification is something that occurs when pesticides in organisms in the lower part of the food chain pass on their internal toxins to their consumers. The toxins become more and more concentrated the higher the trophic level. So you may have a toxin that's in a low concentration here at the bottom of within an ecosystem, and those get inadvertently taken up by producers and stored within them. They can't get rid of them. And then as these organisms get consumed more and more, these toxins just become more concentrated as you move up the food chain. And so by the time you get to the top, the concentration levels get pretty high. And so you find pretty high levels within these organisms. Examples of animals that have been affected by bioaccumulation include bald eagles, peregrine falcons, and beluga whales. Now, with water-soluble pesticides, these can be broken down inside the organism's body and excreted. These chemicals also tend to break down in the environment faster than fat-soluble pesticides. These chemicals can still be passed along the food chain, though, and still can pose a problem. The use of pesticides can eventually lead to pesticide resistance. So many pests are becoming resistant to our pesticides, especially insects and bacteria. So, for example, with the use of antibiotics, antibiotics will kill susceptible bacteria. However, there's always a few resistant bacteria in there. And those bacteria are not affected by the antibiotics. So in the use of antibiotics, you wipe out a large proportion of those bacteria, but you leave a few behind. Those are now the ones that are left to replicate and can slowly take over a population. So now, with the use of those antibiotics again, there's less susceptible bacteria in there. And this cycle just continues until the antibiotic is no longer useful. And so that is the end of this video for food chain.